So they're actively modeling within the US government, for example, whether they can go after Chinese central bank assets.
The time frame they're giving themselves, 2015 to 2025. So according to their own calculations, they really only have 3 years left.
There was a meeting between European and US partners. The US was using terms such as when we sanction China rather than if.
Hey guys. So I'm going to start this video out with a concise statement. The real reason for the war on Ukraine is for the West to run sanctions on Russia so that they can later on sanction China. And I'm going to show you why I think that and how I came to that viewpoint, any evidence I have. But firstly, it should be obvious to anyone that sanctioning Russia and the blowback that the West might get from that on their economies is a far easier task for them than sanctioning China. So firstly, there's that. I mean, if you're the West, if you're like these old money Western oligarchs and, the US government, why not try sanctions on Russia, which is a fraction of China's economy? Why not try those first before you go and sanction China? So there's that just common sense aspect to it to begin with if we look at this thing from the point of view of the West. But prior to the war in Ukraine, and even prior to the whole media frenzy leading up to the war in Ukraine, which lasted like 2 months, what was the major thing happening in the world geopolitically? It was the pivot to Asia. And while Obama's pivot to Asia statement happened years ago, the actual pivot of the West and especially the US towards Asia and towards China started really heating up in the last year or two. Pretty much since COVID, the pivot to Asia has heated up drastically. There were the Trump trade wars, which took on another level after COVID because they could sort of use COVID as an excuse to attack China. So, major decoupling started happening like a year and a half ago. It's all a little bit difficult to remember now because the Ukraine has just come kind of fast and furious, and it's a huge event that has kind of just taken over all media, whether mainstream or alternative. But if we think back, remember the second wave of Hong Kong protests, super violent, and we had officials from the NED there. Other examples of the pivot would be Xinjiang, slave labor camps, genocide. Well, this was the talk that the Western media was pushing. And we also saw a huge influx of regime change operations in Southeast Asia just after the US and the Western armies pulled out of Afghanistan. And I mean, within a few weeks, we started seeing NED-sponsored regime change operations in Myanmar, which saw a coup attempt put down by the Myanmar military. We saw actions in Cambodia, in Thailand. So the trade wars heated things up drastically, but post-Afghanistan pullout, things heated up even more. And that's what was all going on prior to the war in Ukraine. So that aside from COVID, we had the whole Western establishments and mainstream media's attention laser focused in on Asia and China. And then seemingly out of nowhere, all this chatter and talk started coming online about whether or not Ukraine should be allowed to join NATO in the next 20 or 30 years. Which, in the grand scheme of things geopolitically, is incredibly irrelevant. I mean, yes, there are reasons and there were reasons why both sides might have done what they did to lead up to this war, this invasion. Russia and Ukraine have a long history, but that's the micro. That's everything we're sort of focused in on now because Russia and Ukraine were pushed into this situation by Biden, who's a puppet for the Western establishment. But if we look at it from the macro viewpoint, geopolitically, of the Western machine, why did they initiate that whole Ukraine joining NATO at some point in the next few decades thing? If we think of the macro, it came completely out of nowhere. But let's be real here. The Western machine doesn't do things for no reason. And personally, I don't buy into this notion that most leftists seem to buy into, that the US government and the Western oligarchs are a bunch of morons. I mean, say what you will and present whatever arguments you have for that, but in reality, they have tons of experts, they have analysts who crunch numbers. So the fact that Russia's economy seems to be surviving fine and that Putin is demanding gas payments in rubles. I mean, they don't care. And I wouldn't be surprised if they had foreseen everything that's happened prior to nudging the Ukraine and Russia towards war in the first place. All this stuff is small potatoes from their point of view, because they know they have way bigger fish to fry. China. And so let me show you a little clip from a podcast called China Geopolitics. And it was an interview from April 14th of this year of this guy, Finbar Birmingham, who's a journalist or a correspondent for the South China Morning Post.
One of the latest deep dive features you've put together with our colleague Jacob Fromer in the US is how the US and EU are studying quite closely how the sanctions against Russia have worked and how that kind of approach might be deployed against China. Now, the obvious one is Russia's economy quite small compared to the giant that is China. What more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, let me sort of clear it up a little bit. The US is studying whether these mammoth sanctions will work on China. So they're actively modeling within the US government, for example, whether they can go after Chinese central bank assets, whether they can go after China's commercial bank assets. They have floated this with European partners who are far less committal, as you sort of, you might imagine. I mean, despite the sort of souring of the atmosphere in Europe, they're still not at the same place as the United States. They're nowhere near where the US is. There was a meeting in between European and US partners that I'd heard at which sort of the US was using terms such as when we sanction China rather than if. And some of the Europeans were quite shocked by this. It's not a given here by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly not out of the question if they're found to be, for example, contravening or circumventing sanctions. But this modeling is going on in the US. It's fair to say it would be a totally different kettle of fish. You know, the central bank assets of China in the West dwarf those of the Russian central bank. It would be economically really damaging to the United States to seize China's central bank holding of US dollars, for example. I mean, you're essentially writing off your own debt there. So it's a conversation that's going on, but the fact that it's happening, I suppose, shows the sort of extent of feeling, you know, and it also demonstrates, I suppose, you know, the fact that they're feeling comfortable enough to raise this with the Europeans, how far things have changed in Europe.
I would suggest going and checking out that interview. And there's probably an article in the South China Morning Post by that guy Birmingham and the host mentions Jacob Fromer. And yeah, as soon as I heard this interview and what Birmingham had to say, I knew the real reasons for the US pushing Ukraine and Russia into war. And of course, there can be a plethora of reasons why the Western machine takes actions against other countries in the world. I mean, you look at Libya. Why did they attack Libya? Okay, well, Gaddafi was constructing this huge pipeline of water that was coming out from deep under the ground, and it was going to transform that whole region of Africa and the Middle East, apparently. There was also, Gaddafi was apparently constructing an African national bank and a gold dinar. And there were other things that the Libyan government and Gaddafi were doing that was upsetting the Western machine. So there can be multiple reasons for why the Western machine takes actions against other nations. But this sort of modeling of future sanctions for China, that really seems to be the principal reason why the West would have started this whole mess. Because it's been clear for quite some time that China is the big problem for the West. Now, if you don't quite comprehend the magnitude to which the Western power clique is worried about China's rise, then you really need to check out this video by Brian Berletic, and his channel is called The New Atlas. And this was made like 8 months ago. But the reason I bring him up and why I bring this video up is because in this video, he shows a document from the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation is a major think tank within the U.S. military-industrial complex, written in something like 2016 regarding this window of time before China would become too powerful to be able to dominate.
This is a 2016 Rand Corporation paper titled War with China, Thinking Through the Unthinkable. It was commissioned by the US military in 2016, and I just want to show you. On page 9 it says, "We postulate that a war would be regional and conventional. It would be waged mainly by ships on and beneath the sea, by aircraft and missiles of many sorts, and in space against satellites and cyberspace against computer systems. We assume the fighting would start and remain in East Asia, where potential Sino-US flashpoints and nearly all Chinese forces are located." The South China Sea, as you can see there, they're injecting themselves into that deliberately to create a flashpoint there. "We also assume that China would not attack the US homeland except via cyberspace, given its minimal capability to do so with conventional weapons. In contrast, US non-nuclear attacks against military targets in China could be extensive. The time frame studied is 2015 to 2025. So right there, they're admitting that even if China wanted to attack the US homeland, they don't have the capability to do it, not with conventional weapons. They're also admitting that there is this window of opportunity for the US to fight a limited conflict confined to East Asia against China and have a favorable outcome between 2015 and 2025. So you can see how the window is closing very quickly. On page 14, it says, "A long and severe war could ravage China's economy, stall its hard-earned development, and cause widespread hardship and dislocation. Such economic damage could in turn aggravate political turmoil and embolden separatists in China." The US was behind the unrest and the violence in Hong Kong. They're also behind multiple campaigns of destabilization in nations bordering China. In contrast, US domestic partisan skirmishing could handicap the war effort but not endanger societal stability, much less the survival of the state, no matter how long and harsh the conflict, so long as it remains conventional. So the US is saying that if there was a conflict, say in the South China Sea, China would suffer immeasurably and the US would be relatively isolated from it. This is why they would want to fight this conflict sooner rather than later. After 2025, it gets harder and harder for the US to figure out how they would actually even hurt China economically. If the Belt and Road Initiative diversifies China's trade away from maritime routes and overland and circumvents the Indo-Pacific region, how is the US going to set back China's economy to the extent they seek to do so? You could see how the US is playing this double game where they're claiming it's China that's provoking this security threat in the Indo-Pacific region, but how it's actually the US doing it, and how the US knows, they've commissioned entire papers studying this, that these conflicts will hurt China, not help them. China will avoid them at all costs. US is obviously, and getting back to AUKUS, putting the mechanisms in place to ensure that it continues inching towards that conflict that's going to set not just China, but all of Asia back decades and ensure decades more of US hegemony over the region and over the planet. Part of the strategy of encircling and containing a knocked down China and Asia, keeping them from ever rising and threatening Western hegemony ever again.
And he also adds, I don't know if it was in this specific video, he has a couple other videos on the AUKUS versus China subject, but he points out in the document that the Rand Corporation analysts were estimating that this limited sea war with China and this sort of blockade of Chinese commerce in the sea would, yes, hurt the US economy by about 5 or 10%, but it would hurt the Chinese economy by about 25 to 30%. So because it was hurt China's economy so much, they concluded that it would be a worthwhile trade-off. And the most important element of this Rand Corporation document that we just saw Brian explaining was the time frame. The time frame they're giving themselves in order to do major damage to China's economy before China is too powerful to be able to stop. And that time frame is 2015 to 2025. So we're already in 2022. So according to their own calculations, they really only have 3 years left to do some real damage to the Chinese economy and set China back. So I'm not showing you this Rand Corporation document to say that the US is definitely going to carry out this specific type of sea warfare on China prior to 2025. I'm showing it to you to show you that they've been analyzing this stuff pretty intricately, and even as far back as 2016 they were analyzing this, and that through their analysis they figured out a time frame, and they were mulling over various options for how to set China back before it's too late. So now we see that the Western machine and the U.S. military-industrial complex feel pressure. They feel the clock ticking on basically the point of no return for Western hegemony over the world. And with that very tight time frame in mind, we can now view Russia-Ukraine in a different light, geopolitically speaking. And it could be, that the West wants to really hurt Russia first, and by hurting Russia, they hurt China. I see it more in terms of modeling. We could think of it like an architect building a house, making a detailed, intricate model of the house or of the building prior to making the building in real life proportions with real life materials. Same thing here. We've got Russia, tinier economy, is sort of the model house, and they're using it to run models and run analytics prior to doing the same thing to China on basically like a real life scale. Now, in the end, whether they use this sort of limited sea warfare against China, or if they just go with straight sanctions like they're doing to Russia now, I don't know. It's anyone's guess. But what is clear is the West wants to create a separation of the worlds being East and West. And there was actually a meeting of the Quad just about a month ago that said this, frankly. So what this is right here, this is a meeting of major tech companies and think tanks of Quad countries. The Quad being India, Japan, Australia, and the US. And you can see right here, there's a quote from one of the speakers. It says, "To impose sanctions, we need to decouple from China's economy." And I don't know who exactly at the meeting said that, representative from which country, but apparently that was the main takeaway for this organization, ORF, which is an Indian organization that put this video online. So this concept of decoupling from China's economy in order to impose sanctions on them and cause damage to their economy is definitely something they're thinking a lot about. And it speaks to this idea that they may be using the sanctions on Russia to see how full decoupling works, but in a mini setting. The mini setting being Russian banks, Russian natural resources, Russian tech companies. So, Russia is a role play for China. And yeah, we can see that that's something on their mind. And by the way, they've already been decoupling from China for like a few years now. If you watch Brian Berletic's channel, The New Atlas, a number of months ago, he had videos talking about how they were moving microchip factories from Taiwan to Arizona in the US, probably because they want to start havoc in the region, in the South China Sea area, and they don't want it to affect their microchip production. So there's already been some decoupling going on, and that's what, the trade wars were all about. I know Trump seems like a maverick, but he's really just a puppet for the Western establishment, the old money Western oligarchs, who was starting the decoupling process. But what they're gonna do is way more drastic from any light decoupling they've already done. And there's going to be an iron curtain between East and West, and the developing countries, they'll figure out where they fit in. And obviously the West and the Eastern sides will be vying for their support. But it's going to be an iron curtain in regards to tech manufacturing, in regards to economies, and in regards to social media, which is basically our media nowadays. Now, this Quad meeting is a great example of how unabashedly honest some of these participants can be when they're speaking at a meeting that isn't heavily covered by the mainstream media.
From the motivation of the US, and I think Anne put it very well, it's about rules-based international order, liberal international order, however you'd like to put that. If you wanted to, be less kind, you might say it's about US primacy. Okay, that might be what it looks like.
So at the same meeting that they're saying that they need to decouple from China's economy in order to sanction it, i.e. cripple and destroy it, they're also admitting that their overall goal is merely just American primacy. And just a little side note, I know that I keep saying the Western machine or the Western power clique. So the reason I use those terms is because I believe there are oligarchs from old money families in Western countries who run and control the United States. And through the United States, they control the world. And that's what Western hegemony is to me. So yeah, that's the reason I tend to say the Western machine rather than the US government. But that's a distinction we can quibble over in another video or in the comment section. But main takeaways: to impose sanctions, we need to decouple from China's economy. And as we heard from the South China Morning Post journalist, the US camp was already talking about sanctions on China as a foregone conclusion. The time frame set forth by the RAND Corporation that gives them until 2025, another key point to keep in mind. And you can mull this all over and think about it for yourself and see what conclusion you draw. Subscribe to my channel and like the video if you liked it. And if you happen to like this theory that I have regarding why the West pushed Russia and Ukraine towards war, and you decide to use it in an article of yours or a video or a blog of yours, if you could just give me a shout out, I would appreciate it. Just to say, hey, I like this theory and this is the guy I got it from. All right, so I'm going to end it there. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video.